Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the Culture Decoded podcast. Our guest today is Dame Sally Davies, and we are sitting here in the drawing room of the Masters Lodge in Trinity College, Cambridge, which is a remarkable room. Dame Sally is the 40th Master of the Woman to hold the position in its 478 years of existence, and is also the UK's Special Envoy on Antimicrobial Resistance. Dame Sally was also the first female Chief Medical Officer for England and has been, for the same period of time, Chief Medical Advisor to the UK government. Sally has been on the WHO Executive Board for 2 years between 2014 and 2016, has had various leadership roles at the United Nations on antimicrobial resistance, was made a Dame in 2009, a Fellow of the Royal Society, and the inaugural awardee of the Nelson Mandela Prize for Health Promotion by the World Health Organization. And lastly, and this is not a full list, Dame Sally was made a Dame Grand Cross of the Order of Bath, which the first woman outside the royal family to hold such a position and only the second woman to be so honoured, which is remarkable. So, Dame Sally, a very warm welcome to the podcast. Thank you for sparing the time.
Hello.
So, we've got lots to talk about, but let's start with your specialisation, your sort of life's work around antimicrobial resistance. Perhaps you can give the listeners to the podcast just a layman's overview of what it is and probably more importantly, what the challenges are in today's world.
Actually, I've had 3 life works. Let me just make that point. The first was working with sickle cell patients as a doctor. The second was persuading the government to let me and colleagues set up the National Institute for Health Research, making it happen, and being the inaugural director for 10 years. And when I gave it up, we were spending 1.25 billion a year. So antimicrobial resistance kind of overlapped with that.
Thank you for completing the CV. I took some liberties with it, but thank you. Well, actually take your pick on that, because I zeroed in on antimicrobial resistance because there are all sorts of international challenges with that, but the problem
we should zero in.
But take your pick on each one of those 3 chapters as to what you'd like to unpack a little bit.
So we will choose AMR. Antimicrobial resistance, known as AMR, is essentially nature taking its course. If you expose infectious organisms, bacteria, viruses to treatments, they change to try and live, even when you treat them. And those become superbugs. And antimicrobial resistance is the rise of these superbugs, which are now killing people around the world. The last data showed in 2019, 1.3 million people died. It's the 3rd most important underlying cause of death. So naturally, we need to take action.
And unlike a pandemic, it's persistent.
Well, I would argue it is a pandemic, and if you think about it, we still have COVID around, but it's there, it's silent, it's insidious, and it will lose modern medicine for us. After all, antibiotics are infrastructure. Can you imagine a society, well, you could go to Congo or places where you don't access antibiotics, surgery, childbirth are unsafe. Cancer treatment may work if you can get it, but you'll get an infection that's untreatable. Now, this really matters, and it's going on and rising inexorably. And it's aggravated because we misuse across the world, both in the human sector and the food chain, antibiotics, and that drives more resistance, in part because we don't have good, affordable, rapid diagnostics, and then the replacement medicines are not there. We have an empty pipeline.
Did you say 1.9 million people?
1.3 million.
1.3 million people died across the world, estimated. Yet it doesn't get much headline, much attention in terms of it being a persistent pandemic, let's say. You wrote a book not so long ago, The Drugs Don't Work, a Global Threat. So can you talk a little bit about your obvious and well-documented efforts in bringing greater attention and, more importantly, greater cooperation internationally, transnationally on the topic?
So I knew about AMR because when I was a doctor looking after patients with sickle cell, we had deaths of patients because their infections were resistant. And we had other patients who would have an infection and the microbiologist would come along and say, Sally, this one isn't working. I've opened the medicine cabinet and got you another out. Prescribe this. So I knew about it. But it was when I, as chief medical officer, had to write my statutory annual report on the state of the nation's health that I really discovered how severe it had become. And this was in 2013, and I wrote the report on infection. And one by one, the experts said, yes, but we're running out of drugs. Yes, but people are dying. And just threw their hands up in the air at a loss as to what to do. And it was clear that across the world, insufficient action was being taken. The microbiologists, the experts, knew what was wrong, and they kept telling people. But actually, I've often thought the problem is power games, isn't it? If you look at medicine, who's powerful? Well, theoretically, well, no, not theoretically. In practice, it's the plastic surgeons, the cardiac surgeons, the cancer surgeons. They're seen as glitzy. Many of them are macho and see themselves as sexy, actually. Cardiology is close behind. But the poor lab specialties are right at the bottom in terms of power. And it plays out in their salaries too, just to make the point. So the fact the experts knew didn't mean any action was being taken. And what I determined to do was give voice to this problem once I knew about it being so bad in 2013. And it was then, now, more than 10 years ago, I wrote that book, The Drugs Don't Work, really for the public as a short guide. You can read it in 2 hours, and it's still right. I'd love to put in more, now I know about it, about the food chain. Over 70% of antibiotics are used in the food chain, and about the environment. Many factories just splurge out antibiotics, all their precursors, into the water systems and go on to pollute. It's really worrying.
Gosh, where to start with that? And I didn't know at what point in our conversation we would get into it, but let's choose now because it's too tempting not to. The challenges of shifting institutional thinking or institutional power structures, perhaps. And it's interesting you should talk about the implicit hierarchy in the medical profession for the glitzy cancer specialists and the neuro surgeons. You've been at the center of this conversation, the center of government policy setting and international cooperation on this and other topics. So what have you found in terms of the challenges of shifting existing mental models, existing belief systems to actually create a sustainable change in policy, in action?
It's not easy. And to be really successful, you have to take people with you. So it can come from the bottom. Why did we move so well on HIV? That was because of patients making a to-do, families, relatives, this isn't fair, we need action. Why did we end up with NHS 111, even though the doctors didn't want it, though now they do like it? It was because the Labour Party said, we need this. Why do we end up with many things? Because actually the policymakers realise we have to move forwards, whether it's developing our plans for pandemics or whatever, and they see it as their business to do it. But if you want to bring in a new subject, then you have to work it out. And I've done this a bit like playing chess, though I'm not a very good chess player.
I doubt that.
You have to think about the people and take the people with you. So I went to see the ministers and enlisted their help by framing the problem in a way they could understand what their constituents and families would be going through. And it's amazing how many people have experienced AMR in their families if they only knew it. most people in their families have had a case of cancer. And when you say that 1 in 5 cancer patients gets a really serious infection and you don't want them to die because you haven't got an effective antibiotic, people sit up.
Make it personal.
Yes. And then when I started, there was no data. So we managed to persuade government to give us some funding for something we called the Fleming Fund, which helps laboratories across the world develop their diagnostics and therefore their surveillance. So we begin to get data that's being compiled in Seattle to give us the global burden of disease. And the minute you've got data, then that changes how people look at it. I often describe my technique as water on a stone.
Very nice.
Some humour, and never take no for an answer. So if it's going to be no, then I didn't explain that very well. I'll come back and when I've worked it out better.
And water on a stone in terms of its slow effect over time.
Yes, because you have to socialise the problem and the way of going forwards until it becomes, oh, we should do something about this. And then, I mean, my interest is not power, it's influence.
And it's all influence.
It's absolutely. And so mentally, I give myself almost a gold star when I hear someone's done something, which I know that 5 years before they would never have thought of doing or they wouldn't have been able to do in the field of AMR. And I give myself this gold star and think, hurrah, because we've unleashed a movement, a recognition of the need for action, and they're taking it.
So what's particularly interesting about what you just said is your background is science.
Yes.
And we're sitting in a hall with portraits of scientists around the walls. Yet your method of influencing is very human. And it's oversimplified, of course, to talk about left brain, right brain, but you're obviously quantifying the problem in terms of rational, database, science-based thinking. But yet you're you're influencing and creating a movement through a very personal approach. Talk a little bit about that fusion, because that's, in my experience, unusual. You can either have a deeply human approach or a deeply scientific approach, and the challenge is those two often don't meet. Where does that come from? Or did you develop that, or was that innate for you?
It probably comes right from my childhood. My mother did natural sciences here in Cambridge and specialised in applied mathematics before they even gave women degrees in Cambridge.
That was early, yes.
Yes, so I suppose some comes from her. My father was a theologian, so we used to debate morality and moral problems over the dinner table as children. So I think the two sides were always there. And one reason I went into medicine was because I could do the science, but I wanted to help people. And actually, coming from my father, the thing that has always driven me has been my values. I will not go against my values, and it's all value-driven. So to hop back to another subject, when we were establishing the National Institute of Health Research, and people say, how did you do it? I just sat there saying to ministers, chief execs of hospitals, but this is the right thing. How can you not want us to do the best science, to get the best evidence, to look after our patients in the best way possible? How can you not want? I had no plan B because my values said we should do it, and I was so passionate about it. And I'm very passionate about AMR. We must do the right thing by our children and grandchildren, but actually by the world. 1 in 5 children aged under 5 in sub-Saharan Africa die of resistant bacteria. There are 60,000 infants dying of sepsis in India, most of which are untreatable by antibiotics every year. I mean, this is tragic, and it's not fair.
And dying for
lack of effective treatment.
Well, it's lack of effective drugs to be the pipeline. So they're dying of treatable illnesses if you have the right medicines.
Absolutely. And an empty pipeline.
Yes.
What are we going to do? So they use, where they can afford it, last resort, injectables that can damage hearing or kidneys, which may or may not work. I mean, it isn't right. Science can solve this. It's difficult science. It can solve it. So the problem is actually the market.
Right, I was coming to that, yes.
If I explain it to you, we pay very little for antibiotics across the world because most are off patent, they're generics, and there's been a race to the bottom in price and therefore in effluent from the manufacturing and things. That also explains why there are stockouts in Britain, Europe, the States, all the rich countries as well as the poor countries. But that's another problem. So we pay too little. A new one comes on the market, and culturally, we don't want to pay a lot. You put it next door to a cancer drug that can save lives, where we'll pay 100,000, and they balk at 20,000 for an antibiotic. Meanwhile, you can't make the money like you do from, say, high blood pressure drugs, where if people who take them every day for the rest of their lives. So a tiny profit will pile up to a big one. So we're not paying enough. And therefore, the big companies have, many of them, gone out of business on this. They've just stopped. I'm pleased to say GlaxoSmithKline still makes it and makes them and is doing very good research. We in Britain have pioneered for the world what's called a pull incentive. So what we're doing is assessing the value of new antibiotics, and we've done 2 so far and put them into the NHS, where we look not only at the value to the individual, but their value to society, almost like a fire extinguisher. There's a resistant organism there, we better get on top of it, kill it off so it doesn't spread, close a ward, close a hospital, stop a family living and working, kill off communities. And that has been very successful. But we need all of the G7 and more to join in.
Is that a government view to quantify the preventative value?
Yes, this has been done by the NHS formally.
Yes, because the commercial companies don't think that way, do they?
No, they like this method. They would like, and they're pushing very hard for the G7 to pick up pull incentives, and all of them do it. We're hopeful Italy will. Japan has a very small pilot, not big enough at all, but the others have yet to do it. The Americans, if only they could agree, have a bipartisan act on the Hill called the Pasteur Act, which would solve it for them. And it's modelled on our pilot. So we know it can work.
So much of your recent career, and I mustn't summarise your whole career to be just the product of your recent work, has been influencing on the international stage. So United Nations, World Health Organization. You're mentioning a few countries there, and obviously your scope of view and impact is global. I'd love to hear your reflections of a decade and a half, maybe longer, of both the institutions at an international institutions, but also the difficulties and challenges of creating a movement across multiple nationalities with their different agendas, the different cultural backgrounds, the different health challenges.
So it is about creating a social movement, trying to get the global health community looking the same way. But the global health community consists of NGOs, it consists of technical people like myself, but then the politicians. And data has been important. But actually, this is health diplomacy. And I didn't know when I started on this exactly what it was. But diplomacy is about building trust with people, it's perpetually negotiating. You're there, I'm here, where's the common ground? Let's take the common ground and move on, and then have another look. So it's about this trust and diplomacy and trying to understand where others are coming from. So we have, at the end of September, at the UN General Assembly, what's called a high-level meeting on AMR. The first was in 2016. And we from Britain, having discussed what we want out of it, are trying to get the rest of the world to look at the problem from the low and middle income countries' perspective. And we're arguing very vociferously, it shouldn't be looked at from our perspective, But that's where most of the deaths are. We need to support them in preventing infections, sanitation, infection prevention and control, vaccines. We need to support them, and indeed the government has put some money into the pot, in access to routine oral antibiotics. Over and above that, we need innovation. But that innovation, when it comes, should be affordable for all. We, in the Western economies, will have to pay more than the very poor countries. So thinking about it in that way and building trust and moving forward bit by bit. And we won't get everything we want. We won't get everything we need out of that meeting. What we get is an outcome document. But if that can put the markers in the road for a map forwards, then we will have achieved something. And I suppose one of my big learnings is I know what needs doing. I did 10 years ago, but you can't do it overnight.
It's not enough.
You have to socialise. You have to move steadily. So I am unusually in this a tortoise that I hope will win the race. But I've trained myself to take it steadily and slowly, because then you can move forward. Whereas if you try and go too fast, people get anxious or angry, and then you lose the trust, and then you can't.
I'd like to, it seems like the UK has something in its identity as a nation where we lead on these types of soft power issues. And maybe it's a throwback of earlier eras of British history, but we seem to have a very interested external view about global issues. And you can see that evidence in COP26 in Glasgow last year. How is that landing with other nations? Because other nations have their own lens through which they look at the world and their responsibility for it. So how is the tortoise doing in influencing across other nations?
I think we're doing quite well, but it is taking a long time. Come on, I started in 2013 and it's plain obvious what we should do. Within 2 years, I'd worked out what we needed to do. We are respected for our leadership in this, and we are seen as being one of the countries that really not only talks the talk, but walks it. Our own in-country work is excellent. Our own companies like GSK are working in this field, and we put our money where our mouth is. So the Fleming Fund is going up to 400 million. We've just announced 25 million to support laboratory development in the Caribbean. We've just announced 50 million to support access to antibiotics in Africa. So we are seen as really pushing this. Indeed, we've just had a wonderful meeting, but jointly between government, the Royal Society, and Prince William and the Palace on antimicrobial resistance, where people flew in from all around the world, from Japan, from Uganda, from all around the world to discuss what we need out of the high-level meeting, the new burden of disease data, the new economic data showing the damage already to economies and how it'll get worse, and to really move things forward.
The challenge of not only knitting together international coalitions, but also shifting institutional thinking fascinates me. You've mentioned Pasteur, you've mentioned Fleming. I can't resist, and I told you I'd do this, but I can't resist pointing out that over your shoulder is a portrait of Galileo, who of course died imprisoned as a result of his heresy about claiming that the Earth revolved around the sun, not the other way around, in the 1500s. Well, and an example I like to use is Ignaz Semmelweis, who was ahead of Pasteur and Lister in his at least his hypothesis of bacterial microbes. He died in a lunatic asylum.
Yes, rejected.
Rejected by the institution.
Did you go and see the Mark Rylance and National Theatre production?
I did not, no.
Oh, wonderful place.
About Ignaz Semmelweis?
Yes.
I didn't even hear about it. That's a shame.
Earlier this year, it was in the West End. Keep an eye out.
I shall. So, but all of that, Galileo, Copernicus, Ignaz Semmelweis, discovering something very important that they feel advances. Galileo seen as the father of modern day science because his evidence-based discoveries. But that recurs, that challenge of shifting institutional thinking, even the implicit hierarchy you mentioned earlier about in the medical profession. All of that creates layers and strata and established thinking, which of course becomes increasingly difficult to shift. We're sitting overlooking a quadrangle of 500 years old. It's difficult to not allow these institutions to shape our thinking. So maybe a free-ranging question. Given a magic wand, what would you think you would do with that magic wand if, in terms of overcoming the institutional thinking or overcoming even the national competition that's increasingly a factor on the international stage? What's your magic wand in the AMR space particularly?
It needs political will and money across the world. Because science can solve it, and there are some wonderful people. I met a young man from Boston the other day who's found a new way of using microfluidics for rapid diagnostics of bacteria. I mean, this is amazing. I meet people who are interested in phage that probably will have a role. I know that we can make new antibiotics, new antivirals, and of course we can make new vaccines. But all of that needs money and that needs will. One of the big challenges that money and politics and will won't change is, of course, back to people and behaviour. How do we get people to wash their hands? How do we get people to not see antibiotics as, it shows I'm ill that I've been given antibiotics, reinforces my view so I can take time off school or work? How do we get people to recognise that if you've got a viral infection, actually, you don't need antibiotics and all you'll do is drive resistance? So this behavioural piece is really important, and we haven't grappled with that enough, and it's going to take the rest of my life, I imagine.
And I'm so happy you landed there. In some ways, it's a reflection of the tragedy of the commons, is that we recognise the problem in macro scale, but very few people are willing to do something different personally. It's the same with climate change. Lots of people wring their hands, but they're not willing to do away with their 2 international holidays a year, eating meat, et cetera, and having the thermostat on 25 degrees in their homes. It's the personal change of behavior which is always the challenge. And interestingly, coming from a science base, that is almost a blind spot for science, it's the rationalization. But if we range a little bit, that is where Daniel Kahneman and Dickie Taylor in behavioral economics struck upon a very important point. And it's the same in science. And they recognize in economics that there is no such thing as an econ, as the economists talk about an econ. A perfectly rational human being must behave in this way to optimize their interests. Of course, there's no such thing because we're all flawed, emotionally driven in our decision-making. And so they established a whole new field of behavioral economics. Is there
So I use behavioral economics.
Good.
So
well, you
for
must,
instance,
right?
If we're having a feast, we have a run-through of the meal in an evening, and the chef discusses with us what we think of the menu. And quite often I say, delicious. But that meat's far too big. We don't need it that big. And then we have the debate over the people there. Some would like it bigger, some want it as it is, and me saying, actually, people will be full enough and the planet will be better if it's smaller. And generally, we go for a bit smaller. So we do use these nudges, but bringing it into AMR, you have to think, how do you put wash basins where they need to be so people can wash their hands? How do you train them? The northwest of England did a wonderful study, which I really liked. They had tear-off prescription pads. And when someone came to see them about an infection, they'd write the name, they'd tick what was wrong, and they'd tick paracetamol and rest and hot fluids, and they'd sign it, tear it off and hand it over. That helped. When I was chief medical officer, found the 25% of top prescribers of general practitioners and wrote to half of them, a randomized half, over my name saying, you're in the top 25%. Did you know? You might want to look at it.
Prescribing
antibiotics. Now, I did get some postback, which, you don't understand this, that, and the other. And we had a standard letter because, of course, I do, and it's about case mix. Yes. But use of antibiotics dropped by 13%, which saved us, £100,000. It then crept up, but it didn't go back to where it was. It was still a 3% gain. And when we did it again, it dropped. So you can use behavioural techniques, but it is, again, the media's important communication. And one of my colleagues has started working with YouTube influencers. And, how do we use modern ways of communicating and nudging? I think it's going to be one of the big questions.
I think you have to. And the interesting thing is that seems an unnatural act for scientists, but you have to. It's to reach people on the wavelength and the way that they wish to consume information. And a rational appeal to self-sacrifice is never going to work. I think that's very interesting. Let's switch tack a little. We could go down all sorts of rabbit holes there, I sense, very enjoyably. But one of the, maybe a nice link actually in terms of the behavioral side is we like on this podcast to explore mindset. In other words, what does it take? The previous guest on the podcast was Tamara Rocco, who's very, very accomplished artistic director of ballet companies and ballerina in her own right. And she talked very compellingly about what mindset does it take to not only perform as an elite athlete at the top of your game, but also influence others. I'd be interested in that. You've laid a few breadcrumbs early by talking about your family upbringing and your father as a theologian and priest, I believe, and your mother as a scientist, which created an interesting fusion. But how do you unpack now, looking at your experience and your current understanding of mindset and behavioral cues? How do you look at mindset and also influencing the mindset of others in your position? Because your role really is one of influencing, but on a wide canvas.
A big set of questions, aren't they? Yes. So I would say a lot of it's about resilience and working through the pain, to use the metaphor of the ballerina. There are always setbacks. There are always difficulties. There are always naysayers. So it's not, I can navigate a path where they won't be. The question is, how do you deal with it? And you always have to make them feel heard, but actually not take it personally and be resilient enough that you can sit it out and move on. Moving on often means going round the side, but it is about resilience and the pain. When things don't seem to be going the right way, how do you manage that? And one of the things about my role is, of course, I work with lots of people and I have to hold their pain too. But somehow I've learned over the years to be very resilient. So they always tell me the bad news when they hear it, because they don't save it for tomorrow, because they know by the time I've had a night's sleep and got up, I will have found a solution. I'll come bouncing in saying, right, this is how we're going to handle this.
Having absorbed all the suffering and difficulty of others. Well, so I'd like to just, we'll go on that train of thought, but I'd like to just ask, that point around pain is a very interesting one, because we talk about behavioral cues. We as human beings typically turn away from physical pain, but we also turn away from psychological or emotional pain. I think it's in our nature. To have that mindset you've just described, and I heard a little bit of the theologian in the way you talked about it, to say you have to hold others' pain, but there's either a willingness to sustain it because you see it as necessary to achieving your end, or there's actually an inbuilt acceptance that pain is part of the process.
Yes, it is. I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're right. Of course it's part of the process, because people don't want to change. And in changing, it's pain for them, or they push back, which is pain for those of us who want to move forward.
Which is pain avoided or displaced.
Yeah.
And is that something you're drawn to, the difficult problems that are inherently, I mean, we talk about pain as a physical thing, but it's just difficult, high degree of difficulty. It seems like you're trying to tackle
complex problems.
Yes, it seems that way.
Most of the world, I discover, are not very strategic, and complexity scares them, so they go away, whereas I quite like complexity. And I know that if I see it, I talked about a chessboard, or as a jigsaw puzzle, which I don't play either, but it's like picking up a piece and saying, oh, I can do something about that. Let's do that and put it down on the page, and we will build a good picture. And, we've made quite a lot of that picture for AMR, but there's a good way to go.
People are also drawn to that because they turn away or they dislike complexity. People who can connect the dots and simplify the narrative are actually it can be very powerful influencers. And I think that's what you're describing, isn't it?
I suppose it is. Yes, I see it as a picture, and I ask people to do their bit and put it on the board. I should get someone to do me a video or a slide of it, shouldn't I?
Yes, well, you complete the picture for others, right? Most people see part of it, which is, okay, that's...
I mean, let me give you an example. We talk about AMR as a One Health problem because what you do in human sector impacts the food chain, vice versa. Both of us impact the environment.
Yes.
So it's a One Health thing. But lots of people, what do I do about this One Health? And I say, don't worry about it.
Because they see only a part of it.
Yes,
right?
What do you do? What's your role? Do that well, and you're contributing to One Health. Don't worry about, the bigger One Health. Do your own bit well, and you've made your contribution.
Can I ask, so it seems like your appointment as the Chief Medical Officer was inspired because in its very essence, that role is both an influencing role and a connecting role, integrating role, if you like. And I know you've championed not only AMR, but also obesity,
and genomics.
And genomics, indeed. So what was there a moment, did you recognize that was the role that was for you, or did someone else recognize it, or did it just happen as a piece of serendipitous fit?
Oh, all my career's serendipitous.
They often are. Yes.
Yeah. But actually, I was the Director General for Research, running the NIHR that I've talked about, dreaming up, persuading people to let me establish and then making it happen with a wonderful team. And everything I do, there's a wonderful team with me. I do want to put that on record. I don't do this alone. We do it as teams.
And do you, and if I just take that hook and use it, is that a consistent team? Are those people who tend to come with you on that path? Do you form teams as you need them, or are people drawn to what you're doing?
So I had a team for sickle cell. I had a team for research, and now a team that cycles a bit because the civil service does, but, overlaps and builds for AMR.
And in the UN as well?
Well, I have colleagues. I mean, the advantage in health diplomacy of having been around as long as I have is if you build relationships of trust is wonderful for the subject and the nation, actually.
Yes. It's a multiplier effect.
Yes. So I hadn't thought of being Chief Medical Officer.
Yes, that's right.
And then my predecessor, about a year before he retired, sat me down in one of my one-to-ones and said, you should follow me. You should be the first woman Chief Medical Officer. And I actually laughed because I'd never thought of it. I'm not a public health doctor, and I loved what I was doing. But I went home and talked to my husband and he said, oh, you like challenges. You should think about it. So there we are. Here I was.
Here we are. Yes. And of course, you left in 2019. So
perfect timing.
Yes, Napoleon always said he liked nothing more than lucky generals.
Yes.
Right? But a ringside seat or a sort of recently retired from the role to the pandemic, and you, yes, and the CMO had a principal role.
Yes, Chris Whitty did a wonderful job. He's great.
Well, I think he had the nation while all else around him was flapping and panicking. I think he held the nation. We interviewed Chris Jones on a previous episode, who's the CEO of the BMJ, and they were influencing. He was actually started his role at the start of the pandemic, exactly at the start. But the BMJ was quite a principal lobbying force on government policy during the pandemic. Yes, that's a whole different thing. I would like to ask you two questions we like to ask each of our podcast guests. One, which is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, as to ask you to liken your leadership responsibility around the organization you look after. So let's take Trinity College to a collective noun in the natural kingdom, typically animals, but doesn't have to be. Which one would you choose?
So if you'd ask me which animal I am, everyone always says a dolphin. But if we're thinking of Trinity College...
Oh, no, let me ask you why. Why do they say dolphin?
I'd put kind last, intelligent, moving very fast, getting close to people, being part of a shoal. You know?
Not making a splash and then disappearing for long periods of time. No. Okay. So
but for Trinity,
the Trinity College, yes.
I wonder about beavers. If I think about the fellowship working together as a community since 1546, leading science, building things, building knowledge, building for the future, looking after the environment and considering others, yet always working as a community, as a set.
That's very interesting. Is the community here first and foremost a community, a system of people? Is that how it operates?
Yes.
From an insider's
the governing body is the 192 fellows, which I chair, and the charity trustees do most of the work, again, that I chair. But it is about this 192 fellows who teach our wonderful students, but do amazing research as well.
That's a very large number of people to have to.
It's a big college.
I don't know how to shepherd would be the right expression. All right. As a slight aside, Cambridge has developed the ecosystem around the university has developed an enviable global reputation for commercializing innovations in a way that Oxford really struggles to do, or you could argue really hasn't done. What's the secret sauce in that? What do you think really plays out? Because there are world-leading companies within a 15-mile radius of where we're sitting, and it's quite a remarkable success story for the UK.
You can think of Bicycle, you can think of Arm. So we're particularly strong in two areas, biomedical, life sciences, and that comes out of the Laboratory of Molecular Biology, owned by the Medical Research Council. And they've always had this kind of community of small groups with amazing group leaders that are pushing the science forward. They get all the Nobel Prizes too, pushing the science forward by thinking in depth and making new technologies in order to explore it. So often the Nobel Prizes are for the finding, but they had to make that new technology. So, most modern day sequencing has come from that. So that's one area. And because they could see how important it was, they developed this culture of setting up small companies and spinning out and seeing how. And exactly the same happens in the technology area too. And so it's something, yes, in the air, that there are enough SMEs, small and medium enterprises around, that you can see you can do it. And if you fail, it doesn't matter. And of course, we, Trinity, own the Trinity Science Park, which is the first science park in Britain and the biggest and best and most vibrant in all of Europe. So there's something also about critical mass here, which helps.
The ecosystem, but success breeds success. If you can demonstrate that something is possible, the barriers in people's minds that something else might be possible decrease. But it is, Britain's recent history is littered with inventions that others have commercialized. So there really is quite a different thing that's going on here, which you still see, and of course a lot of companies are being bought by private equity houses or American companies or elsewhere. But that commercialization link from the invention to the commercial success is actually not automatic in the UK. So there's something quite special going on here.
And I think it is that critical mass and seeing others do it. And I mean, the latest is one of our young fellows and the driverless cars. And he's raised more than...
Waze. No, I don't mean Waze. Waymo.
Yeah. So Waymo
yes, they've just
has come out of Trinity College.
Is that right? That is a global story.
Yeah.
And they've just completed a fundraise, actually.
They have, very successfully.
And that came from Trinity College.
He's a fellow, a young fellow.
Very impressive young man.
But many of them are. So how do we nurture them and help them?
Well, then let me pause on that, if you don't mind. The 192 similarly impressive fellows. What's the leadership formula that you're employing anyway to generating that individual innovation commitment, but also working as a system? That's a real leadership challenge. It's not so much the typical strong, hard leadership, but there's an influencing and a alignment task there. How do you go about that?
Recognizing that this is a collective endeavor and it's about influence, not power, and not about change, but evolution. And just think, after all, if we've lasted this successfully for nearly 500 years, we're better taking it steadily rather than saying, oh, the modern thing is to do X and doing it, when you might go backwards and forwards and not still be here. A lot of it's about freedoms for the fellows. The Cambridge environment, the fellows within the university and the college for their research have great freedoms to pursue their ideas. And that really makes for the right environment.
It might be an academic environment, but that mantra of influence, not power, and evolution, not revolution, is probably one of the lot of and freedom to experiment is not a bad formula for any organization.
Probably not. And taking the learning from failure, not seeing it as real failure, but a learning experience. Come on, we all have lots of mistakes or failures.
Daily.
If you don't learn from them, it is bad news.
But in many commercial organizations that operate on the opposite end of those axes, so power, not influence, revolution, not evolution, and also a lack of freedom and autonomy, often operate in quite a fearful manner, and actually people
don't do very well in the end, do they?
No, indeed.
I mean, look at the evidence that having more women on your executive board makes a difference.
You've been a big sponsor of women in leadership positions.
Yes.
And obviously a trailblazer, and being the first, as I mentioned in my introduction, being the first in many areas, of course, makes it much more possible for others to follow. Do you see that shifting over your lifetime or over the recent lifetime?
I think it is shifting. Young women now expect to succeed, and that's half of it. I mean, I expected to, but not enough expected to. So we just need to keep pushing for diversity. I think diversity gives a frisson, and it also brings new ideas and new opportunities. We have to do it.
Back to complex problems.
Yes. I like them.
Very good. I got that impression. I have that impression. So last question to finish, and I don't want to make this two desert island discs. However, I would like you to pick a song that encapsulates your leadership journey or your leadership philosophy, or maybe just encapsulates everything that we've talked about.
So my musical tastes are generally much more on the classical, but I did, with my husband, take Our Neighbours from France to ABBA Voyage. So
yes.
I thought I'd pull an ABBA one, which I have used, not this one, I have used ABBA on Desert Island Discs. So how about Take a Chance on Me? Because I did have some concern when I took jobs that how would I be? Would I manage it? So I did ask at each stage the people who appointed me to take a chance on me. And that's what I'm asking the international diplomats and everyone. Take a chance on me, follow me, because I'll take you to a better place.
That's great. It also gives a permission to everybody, women or men, looking at roles that they might not feel qualified for, to actually take a chance on themselves as well.
Yes.
Very good. What a great place to leave it. Let's leave it there. Dame Sally Davies, thank you very much indeed. What a fascinating conversation. I think we could have spent a lot longer diving down more rabbit holes, but I'm very grateful for you sparing the time. Thank you.
Thank you.